That was the question that kept running through Jake's mind long after the television had gone silent. Because what had started as an ordinary summer vacation had somehow turned into a situation neither he nor his mother knew how to explain. And the strangest part was that, only a few weeks earlier, Jake had been convinced that spending the summer alone at home would be the easiest thing in the world. His father had left for a long business trip, while his mother, Sarah, had returned from visiting family only to spend most of her days helping a friend. Jake was 18, home from his first year of university, and suddenly had more freedom than he had ever experienced. At first, he loved it. No schedules. No constant questions. No one checking what he was doing every minute. But freedom has a strange way of exposing things you normally keep hidden. One afternoon, Jake was completely absorbed in his own private world when he suddenly heard the front door open. He had been so distracted that he hadn't even noticed his mother's car returning. Then her voice came from the hallway. "Jake?" He froze. The silence that followed felt enormous. He knew immediately that something was wrong. A few seconds later, his mother appeared at the doorway, and the expression on her face told him everything. She hadn't expected to find him like this, and he hadn't expected her to come home so soon. "I'm sorry, Mom," Jake said quickly. Sarah didn't answer. She simply walked away, leaving him standing there with embarrassment burning through him. For the rest of the evening, neither of them knew what to say. Dinner was unusually quiet. The television played in the background, but neither of them was really watching it. Jake assumed the awkwardness would disappear by morning. It didn't. Instead, his mother finally sat across from him and said something he never expected. "Jake, you're growing up. I know there are things you don't want to discuss with your parents, and I understand that. But we need boundaries in this house." Jake looked down. She wasn't angry anymore. That somehow made the conversation even harder. "I don't want you to feel ashamed," she continued. "But I also don't want either of us walking into situations that make us uncomfortable." For the first time, Jake realized that his mother wasn't trying to control him. She was trying to figure out how to remain his mother while accepting that he was no longer a child. That conversation changed something between them. Over the following days, they became more comfortable talking about adulthood, privacy, relationships, and the confusing emotions that came with growing up. Sarah never judged him, but she also made one thing very clear: love did not mean ignoring boundaries. Jake appreciated that more than he could explain. Then one afternoon, while they were eating lunch, Jake asked about his father. "When is Dad coming home?" Sarah hesitated. The trip was extended. Jake immediately noticed the sadness in her voice. Until that moment, he had been so focused on his own embarrassment and confusion that he hadn't stopped to think about what his mother was experiencing. His father had been away for weeks, and she missed him. That realization changed the way Jake saw the entire summer. Later that evening, they sat together watching television. For once, there was no awkward silence. They laughed at the same jokes, argued about which show to watch, and slowly began feeling like themselves again. But then Sarah looked at him seriously. "Jake, your father will be back soon." He nodded. "I know. And when he comes home," she continued, "things need to return to normal." Jake understood exactly what she meant. The strange summer they had been living through was coming to an end. Yet neither of them realized how much the experience had changed their relationship. Jake had learned that adulthood wasn't simply about having freedom. It was about understanding consequences, respecting boundaries, and recognizing that the people around you were carrying struggles of their own. And Sarah had learned something too: her son wasn't the little boy she remembered. That night, Jake went to his room and looked at the calendar. His father's return was only days away. But then his phone rang. It was his father. Jake answered casually at first, expecting a normal conversation. Instead, his father's first sentence made his entire expression change. "Son, there's something I need to tell you about my return. Jake sat up. Because whatever his father was about to reveal could change everything about what happened next. And suddenly, the summer that Jake thought was almost over wasn't over at all. Jake stared at the phone, suddenly unable to speak. A moment earlier, he had been thinking about the end of summer. Now his father's voice had changed everything. What happened, Dad? There was a pause on the other end. My return has been delayed again. Jake slowly leaned back against his chair. How long? Another few weeks. Maybe longer. There's a problem with the project, and I have to stay until it's resolved. Jake didn't know whether to feel relieved or disappointed. He had been preparing himself for his father's return, believing that the strange chapter of the summer was finally closing. But now the uncertainty had returned. When the call ended, Jake walked downstairs and found Sarah in the kitchen. Dad isn't coming home yet. She stopped what she was doing. What? His trip was extended. For several seconds, Sarah said nothing. Then she lowered her eyes and quietly continued preparing dinner. Jake noticed something he hadn't noticed before. His mother wasn't simply dealing with an inconvenient business trip. She was lonely. And suddenly, the entire summer looked different. The following morning, Sarah sat beside Jake at breakfast. I've been thinking about something, she said. Jake looked up. About your father? About all of us. She explained that the past few weeks had forced them into a strange situation. With his father away and Jake becoming more independent, the two of them had been learning how to communicate as adults rather than as a mother and a child. But independence doesn't mean there shouldn't be boundaries, Sarah said firmly. Jake nodded. I know. And whatever happens while your father is away, she continued, we shouldn't let it damage our family when he comes home. Those words stayed with Jake. Because he realized that the real lesson of the summer wasn't freedom. It was responsibility. From that day forward, things began to change. Jake started spending less time hiding in his room and more time helping around the house. He cooked dinner occasionally. He went grocery shopping with his mother. They watched ordinary shows together and talked about university, friendships, and his plans for the future. It felt normal. And somehow, normal was exactly what Jake had needed. One evening, Sarah found him sitting at the kitchen table looking through university documents. You're worried, she said. A little. About what? Everything after summer. Sarah pulled out a chair. You don't have to have your entire life figured out at 18. Jake smiled. Dad would probably disagree. Sarah laughed softly. Your father thinks every problem can be solved with a spreadsheet. For the first time in days, Jake laughed too. But beneath that laughter was another reality. His father was still away, and nobody knew exactly when he would return. A week later, another phone call arrived. This time, it was different. Jake could tell from his mother's face that something had happened. She listened quietly, asked several questions, and finally said, okay. We'll be ready. When she hung up, Jake immediately asked, what is it? Sarah looked at him. Your father is coming home. Jake's stomach tightened. When? Tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word seemed to echo through the house. For weeks, Jake had imagined this moment. Yet now that it was finally happening, he wasn't prepared. That evening, Sarah packed away the things that belonged to the unusual summer routine. She didn't say much. Neither did Jake. There was no argument. No dramatic confession. Just an unspoken understanding that life was about to change again. Later that night, Jake stood outside his father's room and looked at the empty suitcase waiting beside the bed. For the first time, he understood something his younger self never could have understood. People don't always remember the events that change them. Sometimes they remember the moment they finally understood themselves. And Jake knew this summer had done exactly that. The next morning, a car appeared at the end of the street. Sarah looked through the window. That's him. Jake's heart began pounding. His father was home. But when the front door opened, Jake immediately noticed something was wrong. His father's expression wasn't the expression of a man returning from an ordinary business trip. He looked exhausted. Serious. And after hugging Sarah, he turned toward Jake and said quietly, "Son, we need to talk." Jake's smile disappeared. Because whatever had happened during those weeks away, his father had clearly brought something home with him. And Jake was about to discover that the real story of that summer had only just begun. Jake followed his father into the living room, but something about the silence made him uneasy. His father sat down slowly, placing his travel bag beside the chair. Sarah remained near the doorway, watching them both. "Son," his father began, "the last few weeks haven't gone the way I expected." Jake waited. The man who had always seemed confident now looked tired and uncertain. He explained that the business trip had become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The company had suffered a major setback, several important decisions had been delayed, and he had spent weeks trying to keep everything from falling apart. Jake listened without interrupting. Then his father said something unexpected. "I almost didn't come home." Jake's expression changed. "Why?" His father looked toward Sarah before answering. "Because I thought I had failed." That sentence hit Jake harder than anything else. For years, he had imagined his father as someone who always knew what to do. Someone who could solve problems, provide answers, and remain calm when everyone else was worried. But now Jake was seeing something completely different. His father was human. "I didn't want you two to see me struggling," he admitted. "So I kept extending the trip and telling everyone I was handling it." Sarah finally stepped forward. "You don't have to handle everything alone." Her voice was quiet, but Jake could hear the emotion behind it. His father looked at her and nodded. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then he turned back toward Jake. "You're 18 now. I know you've been making more decisions on your own. I also know I haven't always been around enough to see the person you're becoming." Jake swallowed. "I've changed a lot. I can see that." There was no anger in his father's voice. Instead, there was something Jake hadn't expected. Pride. His father asked about university, his plans, his friends, and what he wanted from the future. At first, Jake gave short answers. But gradually, the conversation became easier. Then his father asked, "What did you learn while I was gone?" Jake thought carefully. He could have mentioned the freedom. The long days. The strange situations. But none of those things felt like the real answer anymore. "I learned patience," he finally said. His father raised an eyebrow. "Patience?" Jake nodded. "I thought being independent meant doing whatever I wanted. But I realized that's not really independence. It's knowing when to stop, when to listen, and when other people matter too." Sarah looked at him with a small smile. His father leaned back. "That sounds like something worth learning." That evening, the family ate dinner together for the first time in weeks. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments. There were questions nobody knew how to answer. But for the first time, they were all sitting at the same table again. And somehow, that felt more important than anything else. After dinner, Jake went outside and sat on the porch. His father eventually joined him. "You know," his father said, "I used to think growing up meant becoming tougher." Jake looked at him. "What do you think now?" His father smiled faintly. "I think it means learning when you don't have to be tough." Jake didn't answer. He simply looked toward the street. The summer had started with him believing that freedom meant being alone. Now he understood that growing up meant something much harder, learning how to live with other people without losing yourself. But there was still one thing Jake hadn't told his father. Something about those weeks had changed him in a way he couldn't easily explain. Not because of one particular event, but because he had finally understood how complicated adults could be. Parents weren't perfect. They were people carrying fears, regrets, disappointments, and hopes that their children often never saw. And that realization made Jake look at his mother differently too. Later that night, Sarah knocked on his bedroom door. "Can I come in?" Jake nodded. She sat beside him. "You did well today." "So did Dad." Sarah smiled. "He's trying." "Are you okay?" She looked surprised by the question. "I think I am." Jake realized that this was the first time he had asked her that. Not as a son expecting his mother to have all the answers, but as an adult genuinely concerned about another person. Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "You've grown up this summer." Jake smiled. "I guess I have." She stood and walked toward the door. Then she stopped. "Jake?" "Yeah?" "Whatever happens in life, remember something. You don't become strong by avoiding difficult moments. You become strong by learning what those moments are trying to teach you." The door closed. Jake remained awake for a long time. Outside, the house was quiet again. But this time, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. And as Jake looked at the calendar, he realized the summer was nearly over. He had entered it believing he was simply waiting for his father to come home. Instead, he had learned something far more important. Sometimes the person you become while waiting is completely different from the person who was waiting in the first place. But Jake had no idea that one final conversation before university would force him to question everything he thought he understood about his family. And that conversation was only days away. Jake could tell immediately that something had changed the moment his father walked through the front door. The man who had left weeks earlier seemed different now. He looked exhausted, distracted, and unusually serious, as though the business trip had brought home problems he hadn't yet figured out how to explain. "Son, we need to talk." Jake followed him into the living room. Sarah remained in the kitchen, quietly putting away groceries, but Jake could feel that she was listening. His father sat down and rubbed his forehead. "The project didn't go the way we expected," he finally said. "There were delays, arguments, and a lot of pressure. I almost didn't make it home this week." Jake nodded. "Are you okay?" His father looked at him and smiled faintly. "I'm okay now." That answer should have reassured Jake, but something about it didn't. Then his father said something Jake hadn't expected. "I realized something while I was away. I spent so much time worrying about work that I forgot what I was missing here." Jake remained silent. "Your mother. You. This house. I kept telling myself that providing for the family was enough, but it isn't." Those words stayed with Jake because they sounded strangely familiar. His mother had spent the summer learning that her son was becoming independent, while his father had spent the same summer realizing how quickly life could change without him noticing. For the first time, Jake understood that everyone in the family had been going through something. That evening, they ate dinner together. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments and long silences, but there was also laughter. His father asked about university. His mother complained about the grocery prices. Jake told a ridiculous story about one of his classmates, and suddenly all three of them were laughing. It felt ordinary. And Jake realized how much he had missed ordinary. Later that night, Sarah found Jake sitting alone in the hallway. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah." She sat beside him. "You've been quiet." Jake looked toward his father's room. "I think Dad really missed us." "He did. Maybe we all needed this summer." Sarah smiled. "Maybe." Jake thought about everything that had happened. He had entered the summer believing that being an adult meant doing whatever he wanted. Instead, he had discovered something much more difficult. Being an adult meant knowing when to stop. It meant understanding consequences. It meant respecting the people you loved, even when nobody was watching. And most importantly, it meant learning that freedom without responsibility wasn't really freedom at all. The next morning, his father surprised everyone by announcing that he wanted to take the family away for a few days. No work, he said. No phones during dinner. Just us. Jake laughed. Dad, are you sure you're feeling okay? His father laughed too. Very funny. For the first time in months, the family began planning something together. Jake packed his bag, but before leaving his room, he stopped and looked around. The room seemed exactly the same. Yet he wasn't. The summer had forced him to grow up faster than he expected. He had learned that embarrassing moments could become lessons, that difficult conversations could repair relationships, and that patience could reveal things anger never could. As they drove away from the house, Jake looked through the window at the street disappearing behind them. His mother noticed. What are you thinking about? Jake smiled. Just thinking about how different everything feels. Sarah nodded. That's what growing up feels like sometimes. Jake looked at his father driving ahead. Then he looked at his mother. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about the strange events of the summer. He was thinking about what came next. Because the real challenge wasn't surviving one unusual summer. It was taking everything he had learned and becoming a better person because of it. Years later, Jake would remember that summer differently. Not as the embarrassing chapter he once wanted to forget, but as the moment he finally understood patience, responsibility, and the value of family. And whenever life became difficult, he remembered something his mother had told him before they left that morning. You don't have to understand everything today. Give life time to explain itself. At 18, Jake hadn't understood those words. But eventually, he would. Because sometimes the greatest lessons don't arrive when everything makes sense. They arrive when nothing does. And sometimes, the moment you think your story is ending is actually the moment you finally begin to understand why it happened.